Hello, I'm Robert Emmett Hernan, the head of Blue Stack Productions, publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine covering environmental matters on the island of Ireland. I'm very happy today to be here in Dublin again with Michael Ewing. Michael, how are you?
I'm very good, Bob. Thank you for inviting me to be interviewed.
And it's good to see, we met and interviewed each other with, actually I interviewed you in October 2012. We had a conversation in 2012. Yeah. I thought it would be helpful to come back and revisit with Michael to find, because he's head of two organizations which are served as an umbrella group for the environmental groups in Ireland, to see what's been going on the last couple of years, what's been working and what kind of still remains to be done. Michael, we did all the background for how the organizations work, but I think it would be helpful to the audience if you explain to them what the two environmental organizations are, the Irish Environmental Network and the Environmental Pillar.
Sure, no problem, Bob. Okay, 2001, the then Minister of the Environment went to an international conference and was asked where his environmental groups were, and there were none with him, and every other country had environmental groups participating. So he came back and said to the environmental NGOs at the time, I want to give you some money to go to international conferences. And they said, well, actually, what we really need is money to exist. So they eventually did an arrangement with him, and a network was established. It had a very long title at the time. Later became the Irish Environmental Network, and the government agreed to give a certain amount of money every year in core funding to be shared out between the members.
And how many members are there now?
Well, at the moment there are 32 members, and there's another one applying at the moment. So there are 32 members of the Irish Environmental Network, and the network essentially is a support structure for the members. Its objective is to enable the members to do whatever it is they want to do, as well as possible, either individually or all together in groups. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the overall picture of that. And then when the Green Party got into government in 2007, part of their programme for government was that they agreed that there would be a new social partner created. There were four already in existence. There was the farmers, the trade unions, the employers, and the community and voluntary sector were all pillars of social partnership. So they were involved in a process with government to deciding on in general terms, on what the government would do over the next 3 months, in different over the next 3 years, rather, different periods of time. So the environmental sector had been excluded continuously up until 2009, when the Green Party demanded, in fact, that the government then agreed to the establishment of a fifth pillar, which is the environmental pillar, hence the name, because it's a pillar of social partnership. Around that time, the old structures of no social partnership collapsed, but we were still a social partner, which gave us a lot of authority and a lot of access, which didn't exist before. Previously, the environmental sector would have been outside the door for most things and knocking, trying to get in. Suddenly the doors were open. The environmental pillar had the right to nominate people to a range of different bodies, nationally and locally. So we had 166 at one stage, 166 people nominated on over a range of local authority bodies. Some of them about policy, some of them were governing bodies, and on the various local development companies we had people on the boards there. Mm-hmm. And then we also have people on a range of national institutions, including the National Economic and Social Council, where we had at the time 4 places, now 3. It's been reduced in size. We also had people, one person nominated onto the European Economic and Social Committee, which is quite unusual. There are very few environmental people nominations on there from any country. Mm-hmm. So we managed to achieve that as a result of the Green Party being in government, and we've been holding that position ever since. So that's the difference. The environmental pillar basically is an advocacy body. Okay. It speaks on behalf of the 30 members of the IN who form the pillar. They speak in a consensual fashion. So that was it. When the discussions were had with government, they said, we want a pillar that speaks as one. Mm-hmm. So there's a memorandum of understanding between the members which says how we behave with each other, how they relate to each other, how voting is done, how decisions are made, how new ideas are brought forward, and how they are then adopted, and so on. So there's quite a clear, all-encompassing structure there, which has been developed over the last, where are we now, 9 years nearly, since the pillar was established.
Now, now there's a large overlap between the two, but any sense of how many members there are, total members of all the groups?
It's difficult to estimate, because some of the organisations do have kind of clear paid membership, and some of them have supporters. Uh-huh. Roughly between 35 and 50,000 individuals.
Okay.
But then we also have a lot of local networks as well, which we're establishing, which I can talk about later if you like. Uh-huh. The environmental, or maybe even now, the environmental pillar. When the environmental was formed, as I said, it had the right to nominate people onto a lot of bodies around the country. And then in 2013 rather, then Minister for the Environment, Phil Hogan, decided he wanted to reform local government. And in the process of doing so, he also wanted to change the way in which local communities engage with local government.
Mm-hmm.
So he asked a number of people to sit down in a room for 6 weeks and figure out how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I happened to be one of them. Sean Healy was the chair of the group, and out of which came this thing called the Public Participation Network.
Mm-hmm.
And the Public Participation Network is essentially all the non-government organisations and not-for-profit organisations within a local authority area can be members of the PPN,
Mm-hmm.
Public Participation Network. And it's divided into 3 electoral colleges: community and voluntary, which is pretty much everybody; social inclusion, which is obviously, as it says on the tin; and then the environmental sector,
Mm-hmm.
which is the smallest section. But we have the same nominating rights. So despite the fact we're the smallest, probably only 3% of the total membership nationally, we have the same nominating rights, because when we went into the PPNs, we had all these rights before, and we said, look, we want to join the PPNs because we want this new structure to be focused on sustainable development. Mm-hmm. So we went in there to do that. That was our mission.
Mm-hmm.
So we went we became partners in the whole process of developing the PPNs. We've been very active in it. And one of the lines that's in the original statement on the structure of the PPNs is that each PPN has to develop a vision for the well-being of its community for this and future generations.
Mm-hmm.
So along with Social Justice Ireland, we've been developing a toolkit which is now finished, which is to enable those organisations to develop their well-being statements, their vision for well-being of the community for this and future generations. So we now have an online tool which enables them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
We spent 3.5 years developing this toolkit, working with stakeholders and with community groups and with the PPNs to actually work out how that can be done effectively. So the idea is now that all the PPNs over the next number of months will develop their own visions. There'll be a high-level vision, but everything they do after that will be based around this vision.
Mm-hmm.
And it will include environment, it will include all aspects of sustainable development. So this was a major achievement for us.
And the representatives of the environmental groups are members of the pillar?
Not necessarily, they're local organisations.
So they might not be members?
Might not be members at all. There might be a local nature group, there might be a local organisation that's kind of specialising in some particular aspect of the environment.
And who selects the representatives for the environmental aspect?
What happens is when people register with a local authority to become a member of the PPN, register with the PPN to become a member, they self-select themselves into one of the 3 categories. If they go for the environmental sector, then the PPN Secretariat sends me a letter saying, is this an environmental group or not? And we apply the same criteria to them as we do to our national organisations.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they don't have to be national, but they have to fit into the basic criteria of being pro-environment,
right,
pro-sustainable development.
Mm-hmm.
There's ballpark descriptions.
Uh-huh.
Once they fit into that and they're a really existing organisation, then I will write back to the PPN and say, yes, they're an environmental group, they can be let into that college. So that's the way it works. So we're at the moment reaching out to find, we have a person working in the office searching out the country for environmental groups that haven't actually registered.
Okay.
But the other thing we've done is we've established, because we had this network of people out there already that we've nominated onto various bodies, we're in the process of establishing a local environmental network in every local authority area.
Mm-hmm.
There are 22 established already, and there's been another 9 to go.
Mm-hmm.
And that same person is working on those. That's Catherine, Catherine O'Toole. She's doing the work on that. And she is basically reaching out to the individuals and groups in each local authority area and saying, look, let's set up a local environmental network so we have Roscommon Environmental Network where I live.
Mm-hmm.
And it's relatively new in its new structure. And we've had 2 farm walks on organic farms in the last 6 months. We're planning to run an event next spring on high nature value farming in Roscommon. So these groups are all independent.
Right.
And they're doing their own thing. We're hoping in the new year, with the assistance of the EPA, that we're going to actually do a lot of work with them on climate, to get them to do local work on climate, both progressing the climate dialogue locally, but also beyond that, kind of looking at ways in which they can either abate climate change locally or they can mitigate against it. So these are all new developments. They're all brand new sort of things that have happened in the last while.
And it was 2014.
They're very positive.
I think that is an enormous achievement.
It is, yeah.
And I want to come back to that at the end when we
Sure.
also talk about the Citizens Assembly, perhaps,
Yeah.
and a couple other public participation efforts.
Yeah, sure.
But in a general way too, I also want to ask you other kinds of achievements that have been achieved by the environmental movements. Not necessarily just the pillar involved with that, but other groups involved with it. Over the last couple of years, what are the biggest things that happened?
Well, I mean, the ban on fracking was clearly a major success. I mean, that was a long struggle. It was led by local people mostly in the area, with the support of national organisations, in particular Friends of the Earth, one of our members, but also the environmental pillar members broadly. And the local groups led the charge very effectively.
This is the Love Leitrim and other groups?
Love Leitrim and anti-fracking groups, and then the Good Energy Alliance Ireland, which formed as a process of that, is now a member of the environmental pillar. So there's a number of local groups and individuals who campaigned. I mean, the level of activity in Leitrim was phenomenal. I went to a meeting in Bush Hotel, which is a relatively small hotel. It couldn't get the people in. There was a room for 200 seating, and there was probably another 200 standing outside the door. It was just extraordinary, the amount of strength of feeling about it, and the follow-up action as well. It wasn't just going to a meeting. It was actually kind of getting busy, and persuading politicians. And then I suppose one of the other things in the favour of it was actually the status of the current government, being a minority government, made it possible to bring this about, the fracking ban. It wouldn't have probably happened if there had been a majority government, because they would have gone the way of the normal route of supporting what is the status quo in these matters. So that was a major achievement of the environmental movement.
And also, Michael, was that also possible because there was a fairly good support within the farming community against fracking?
There would have been,
because of the risk to
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. I mean, the potential hazards, as you probably know, coming from where you live and looking around the sort of northeast of the United States, the amount of damage being done by the fracking industry is phenomenal. And the potential harm to a landscape, which is a very kind of traditional landscape, if you like. It's small farms and people just scraping a living of it, essentially off of very poor land. To have people coming in there and building pads every kilometre or so, and all the disruption and all the damage to water supplies and everything else, farmers and everybody in the community, because it would be basically a rural community in Leitrim, a couple of small towns, very rural community, and also North Roscommon, don't forget, it wasn't just Leitrim, and Fermanagh as well, and there were all the whole area around. And
I interviewed the people in Leitrim and in Fermanagh, and one of the interesting things that happened in Fermanagh, it bridged the divide between the nationalist and unionist communities, because they had the same interests, and that was very helpful. How about the divestment bill? Has that been finalised? It was the fossil fuel divestment?
Basically, Ireland doesn't have a lot of investments in fossil fuels, but it had some. It was important because it actually created a movement. So there were a lot of young people got involved in this, as they did in the anti-fracking movement. And there's been a general waking up of young people in this country in the last 5 or 6 years in relation to a lot of different things, and environment is one of them. So you're seeing a kind of growing movement there. So the divestment bill was a really good focus, particularly in Trinity College, but across the student movement, but across the environmental movement as well. And it kind of brought together, basically it means the government has to sell all its investments in fossil fuel industry and never invest in them again. Essentially, that's what the bill says. It's an awakening of people, awakening of, as I say, particularly of young people, who in the past have shown some degree of lack of interest after a certain age. We have really good programs in Ireland in terms of schools, primary schools, green schools and so on, and in secondary schools. And we also have green campuses.
It's interesting, Michael, too, that you mentioned the green schools. My sense, too, was I interviewed people at the green schools here at Antashka. And the green schools started primarily in the primary schools, and then they expanded in secondary schools. And the kids were going through that program. And then all of a sudden, those kids from secondary schools end up at colleges, and they started pushing for green colleges. And they're still pushing.
Another thing in relation to colleges is this, the Sustainable Development Goals.
That you're
are you happy to go with that now?
You're pointing to your button.
My button here, which has got 17 different colours on it. Essentially, I'll just go on to it now because it's relevant to what we're talking about in terms of colleges. It's relevant to colleges because the European Union funding for research now is going to insist on colleges showing how they're going to what they're doing is going to enable the implementation of the SDGs.
Now, explain
Sustainable Development Goals
from the UN.
The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Some of you may be familiar with the Millennium Development Goals, which are created back in the turn of the millennium, as it happens, in the turn of the millennium, to promote development in the developing world. In the meantime, it became apparent that you couldn't really change the developing world without changing the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a serious stakeholder conversation across the planet for 4 or 5 years with individuals and groups joining with the United Nations in trying to develop a vision for what could be a different way of working on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And this then came to the point of where it was becoming an international between countries conversation. And the conversation between countries was chaired by 2 of the United Nations ambassadors. One was the Irish one was the Kenyan one.
Mm-hmm.
And they did a brilliant job. What they came up with was the idea that there are 17 sustainable development goals that have to be achieved by 2030.
Mm-hmm.
And 193 countries signed up to this. So they all say it's a voluntary code, if you like, but it's still, there's a peer pressure thing going on here. So they're all supposed to deliver on these 17 goals, and each goal has targets, and each target has indicators.
Mm-hmm.
So they're all being measured against these. Now, obviously, what is a target for a developing country might be way too low for a target for Ireland, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So there are different targets being developed by the European Union, for example, for Ireland. So, so the Irish government was one of the leaders in this process. And so the Irish government is in an interesting position of having to show that it's continuing to be a leader, which it wasn't really doing to start with, to be honest with you. We ourselves organised an event shortly afterwards with government officials and our own members to kind of look at some of the environmental ones, because there are at least 4 specifically environmental goals,
mm-hmm.
but pretty much every goal relates to the environment ultimately, one way or the other. So there's life on land, life under the sea, climate, there's circular economy, there's things like agriculture, food,
mm-hmm.
you know, and obviously soils in that and all the rest of it. So every aspect of it is kind of related to it. Ireland has to deliver on this. Every country has to deliver it. The European Union has to deliver on it. So the European Union, one of its things it's doing is saying that all funding for research from now on from the European Union will require the funding, the body getting the money to show how their project is going to progress the Sustainable Development Goals in their country or internationally. So this is like a very soft way of changing things, but it's actually making differences.
Yeah, it's not so soft in the sense it's kind of fundamental.
Yeah.
It's interesting, there's a parallel with insurance companies now, increasingly, especially in Ray and larger insurance companies, are now requiring the insurers to demonstrate how they're going to, like in a big public project, how they're going to account for climate changes.
Yeah.
And so it's a very serious requirement.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're not going to fund you if we're going to pay for something that's going to be built and then wiped out in 5 years.
Absolutely.
But what about the recent decision by the High Court on the constitutional right to the environmental protection? We could tell the audience, well, that's a kind of a major issue.
It is a major issue. It's an untested one at the moment. It was a ruling of the court which said, you know, that there's an undefined right in the Constitution to a healthy environment.
Mm-hmm.
There's not written in the Constitution there's anything about an environment at all, but there's a basic right contained in there. It makes logical sense that right should be upheld under the Constitution. That's basically what the judge said. Now that has not been tested in any other case,
right.
And until it is, it remains as a kind of aspirational. I mean, you're a lawyer, you know better than I do what this means, but it's there as a marker. I mean, we for a long time have been campaigning to get the Constitution changed to include a right to the healthy environment.
Yeah.
So this is actually very positive from our perspective.
Now, Michael, tell the audience about the something new that happened a couple of years ago, the Environmental Law Implementation Group.
Most of you will be familiar with the whole trouble that happened up in Mayo in terms of the gas fields.
Mm-hmm. The Corp
gas fields, exactly, yeah. And the long struggle of local people there and the long struggle of environmental groups as well to try and stop that from happening and to make sure that the environmental law was implemented properly. And during that process, a case was taken by Antashka against the Irish government, and Bob Planola and I think Mayo County Council, that they weren't actually applying the law in terms of European law and the environmental impact assessment legislation. Mm-hmm. The case went a long way in the courts, and it got to the point where it was getting. Antashka basically were, they were taking very high risks going any further, as I understand it. I wasn't involved in this process. But anyway, there was a settlement made out of court between Antashka and the other parties. And again, I haven't seen the settlement, but this is one of the outcomes was an arrangement would be made that the government and the environmental movement, Antashka and the environmental people together, would work to establish a body that would prevent this kind of thing happening again.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea then was that there would be an interface, a structured interface between government and the environmental NGOs to look at the way in which existing law is being implemented, future law might be written and implemented, and any upcoming problems in terms of environmental law or things that are happening in the environment which might end up with the Irish government having muck on its face because it's breaking European law, or indeed other international law. So a conversation then took place between the Department of Environment officials and the Environmental Pillar and Antashka, and the body was established called the Environmental Law Implementation Group. Terms of reference was agreed, and then the government agreed to fund the process, the NGO side of the process, and gives a sum of money every year to fund it. And out of that money, it was decided to employ a facilitator who works full-time on the whole area of environmental law, and making sure that she is, there's a tractive in, making sure that she is able to pinpoint what's going on in the environmental law space in Ireland and in Brussels and in Geneva in terms of the Irish Convention, and indeed globally, to see where the Irish government is actually tripping itself up, or likely to trip itself up, or has already tripped itself up in terms of the law, and to making sure they're fully aware of what's going on, and making sure our members, the Environment Pillar members and Antashka, are able to inform the government where things are coming, problems that are about to appear. And that's the purpose of the ELIG, the Environmental Law Implementation Group. And it's been working very effectively.